We're going to use a hoist today, not jack stands, and we're going to go ahead and remove the wheels and tires. So first we're going to start off and we're going to remove the ABS line so the wire doesn't get pinched or broken while we're working. We use a panel popper or trim tool remover. Remove these push pins. I'm going to use an 8mm socket on a ratchet to remove the sensor. Get that out of our way so we don't break the wire. There are two 15mm bolts holding the brake caliper on we need to remove. We're going to use a bungee cord or relate something similar to hang the brake caliper so it doesn't stretch the brake hose. Don't want to scratch your brand new calipers also. Sometimes we install a lug nut to keep the brake rotor in place so it doesn't fall off while you're trying to remove the brake caliper. You gotta remove that, remove the brake rotor, get it out of our way. We're gonna remove these 24mm nuts right here to remove these bolts to remove the strut. We're just removing these bolts to remove the strut. Separate the strut from the spindle. We're gonna grab an 18mm wrench to break this nut free. We're gonna use an 8mm socket on the stud so we can hold that in place while we work the nut off of the stud for the sway bar end link. Once you remove the 18mm nut, you can take the sway bar end link out and tuck it out of the way so it's out of your way. Next, we're going to remove these 15mm nuts that hold the strut in place so we can remove the strut from the bottom. And be sure to hold the strut up in place so it doesn't fall when you remove the last nut. So we have our Ride Tech coil-over. We're going to install this stud plate underneath and put this shim plate on top. This is to adjust our camber and caster. We're gonna go ahead and install the strut from the bottom. Go ahead and install all your nuts on top to hold the strut in place. The new nuts for the new strut are 14mm or 9/16, so we have to snug them up and then we'll torque them to spec later. So we're going to install the lower strut bolts. It does come with these slugs that go into the coil-over. It has two different positions for street or track, depending on how much negative camber you want to run. We're going to use a 24mm socket to retighten the lower strut nuts. Again, torque to spec afterwards. All right, we're going to reinstall the brake rotor. And again, put a lug nut on there to hold the rotor in place so it doesn't move around on you. We're going to install the brake caliper carefully so not to scratch it. Again, use a 15mm to tighten down the brake caliper, and it'll be torque to spec afterwards. We're going to reinstall the ABS sensor in the back of the spindle now that we have the strut installed with an 8mm socket. And secure the wires so they don't get cut up on anything. We're going to remove the sway bar end links completely to aid in the removal of the sway bar. It's an 18mm nut and an 8mm socket to hold the stud in place. We're going to remove the mass airflow sensor connectors from the airbox and the vacuum lines so we can remove the airbox to better access the sway bar bolts that we have to remove. because it isn't a very easy clip to disconnect. There's a tab on the bottom of the connector. This one's much easier to get to. We're going to remove these 7mm hose clamps to remove the hoses off of the throttle bodies. Then we're going to remove the 10mm bolt on either side that holds the airbox in place. There's some plastic tabs for the air intake that need to be moved out of the way. It's kind of tricky to get to. There's a plastic heat shield next to the frame rail for the alternator. Gotta remove these push pins. This just pulls out of the way. We're gonna remove the 4 bolts holding the sway bar on, one right here and one back behind the alternator. That one's gonna be a little tricky though. You're gonna have to use an 18mm ratcheting wrench to be able to work that one out. And there's 2 on the other side as well. Good look. I'm going to use an 18mm socket with various extensions, and a swivel will make it easier to remove these bolts. Use a ratcheting 18mm wrench to work the rear bolt that's underneath the alternator. At this point, we're going to remove the sway bar out the driver's side wheel well. This is one of the trickiest parts of the job. If you don't feel comfortable with it, please take it to a professional and have them do it for you. It helps to have a second person help fish it through because it is rather tricky to remove. On the new sway bar, we have 2 different positions. Position 1 towards the front has a stiffer ride to stiffen up the sway of the vehicle. The rear position is more of a street use. We're going to go ahead and install it now. We're going to install the bushing and the bracket that sits on top of the sway bar mount. It spreads open to where you can move it around the sway bar, like so. There's a tab welded onto the sway bar, so you just push the bushing all the way against it to where it'll hold it in place. Again, push it against the welded tab so the bushing stays in place, and work the bracket seated on top. Reinstalling the factory hardware to hold the new aftermarket sway bar in place. Grab your extension swivel and 18mm socket to reinstall the factory hardware. We're going to reinstall our sway bar end links with our 18mm nuts. Top side of the coil-over. And for our use, we're going to put it on the street side of the sway bar. You use our 18mm wrench and our 8mm socket on a ratchet to hold the stud in place while we tighten the nut. And do that for both top and bottom. And now we're going to reinstall the air intakes. All right, we're going to start off by removing the sway bar. We need to get these brake hoses out of our way. Well, they're 10mm sockets. All right, now we're going to remove the sway bar end links and remove the sway bar mounts. This is an 18mm wrench and a 6mm Allen to break these free. And for the mount, we're going to use a 13mm socket. You can locate your 4 sway bar bolts that hold the mounts here and here, right in front of the exhaust. We're going to remove the end links entirely so we can install them on the new sway bar. There's 2 hangers we have to loosen for the front of the exhaust and the rear of the exhaust to make space to remove the sway bar. These are also 13mm. With the exhaust hangers removed, this will allow you to snake out the sway bar. All right, I'm going to place a pole jack underneath the lower control arm so it doesn't move on us when we unbolt everything. Obviously, if you're doing this at home, you'd use a jack stand instead. We're going to start by removing the factory strut shock assembly out of the way so we can remove the coil spring. It's 18mm bolts up here and 2 15mm bolts on bottom. Now that we have the strut removed, we're going to remove this 21mm bolt. It's fairly long to be able to swing down the lower control arm to remove the spring. All right, next we're going to use a 15mm socket to remove this lower bolt right here. We're going to go ahead and lower this lower control arm to be able to remove this spring. You're going to probably need a second person and a couple of large pry bars to pry this out of its pocket. On the newer models, I have this electronic e-brake caliper that needs to be removed just to give you a little more space. It also has 13mm nuts. Now that we have the caliper removed, we're going to remove this 10mm bolt just to move this brake line, massage it out of the way so it'll be out of our way for the spring. There's these 2 coil spring isolators that we're going to go ahead and remove because they're just going to be flying around. You don't want them to fall off the vehicle once the spring is removed. We're going to go ahead and reinstall this 21mm bolt in the lower control arm, and the other side with the 15mm. We're going to go ahead and temporarily install our upper bracket right here with our 19mm bolts that come in the kit so we can drill out our holes with the included drill bit to install our nut certs. We're going to go ahead and use a paint pen to mark where we're going to drill our pilot holes. We're going to remove these brackets before we drill the holes so we don't damage the brackets. We'll go ahead and remove this ABS wire clip so it doesn't get damaged while we're drilling our pilot holes. It's good practice to remove any other hoses or wires out of your way. Installing RideTech products are great because they come with necessary tools like this drill bit to be able to install these nut certs. The kit comes with this tool to install these nut certs. You hold this bolt still with a 14mm wrench while you tighten the 16mm nut that's around the bolt, and it will compress this nut cert and hold it in place inside the body of the car. Now that we have our bolt tool inserted in our nut cert, we're going to hold this 16 still and tighten this 14 by hand so it compresses the nut cert in the hole. Now that we have our nut certs installed, we can reinstall our bracket and put our 19mm and 14mm bolts. Go ahead and snug them down and torque them to spec. The lower bracket is side specific with where it mounts to the coilover offset towards the rear of the vehicle. We're going to go ahead and put the square head bolt inside so where it'll sit flush against this tab right here. Once we have that, we can insert our bearing spacers into the coilover and run the bolt through. Use a 19mm socket and wrench to tighten the bolt. Now that we have the lower bracket assembled onto the coilover, we can install it into the strut mount where we remove the factory strut and use a regular 3/8 bolt on the front hole. And use a nut and washer on the lower bolts. Go ahead and tighten both nuts with a 14mm socket. We're going to go ahead and insert these bearing inserts into the top of the coilover. You will probably need to use a pole jack or a floor jack to raise the lower control arm to where it'll line up so you can insert the bolt to the hole. And it's a 19mm bolt and nut. You can go ahead and tighten those down. We're going to install our rear sway bar. Installing the sway bar relocation bracket, we're going to mount the factory hardware up to the subframe with the machine holes facing the rear of the vehicle. We're going to tighten these bolts with a 13mm wrench. Now that we got our relocation brackets installed, we're going to install the bushings and the hardware to hold the sway bar in place. These bushings just spread open and move around the sway bar. Using a 14mm socket to hold your hardware, we can now install sway bar brackets. Centering the sway bar bracket, we're going to go ahead and tighten the hardware. After centering the sway bar, we have these retaining sleeves that we put on the inside edge of the sway bar to tighten them in place. Using a 3/16 Allen wrench. We have 3 points of adjustment on the rear sway bar. Standard street use, and it increases as you go on. I'm going to go ahead and install the sway bar end links. I'm going to tighten them using the 18mm ratcheting wrench and a 6mm Allen to hold the stud in place. Next, we're going to reinstall the two 10mm bolts, one for this hose and one for this solid mount back behind the spindle. with a 10mm socket. Now that we have the brake hose mounted, we can install the caliper with our 13mm slide pin bolts. At this point, we can go ahead and reinstall our exhaust mount brackets. One right here, and here, and then the two in the rear side by the mufflers. We've shown you both front and rear on one side. Repeat the process on the other side. Then you can reinstall your wheels and tires. We can sit on the ground and set the ride height. To adjust the ride height on the coilovers, the vehicle on the ground, you can use the spanner wrench to adjust these collars either way, lower or higher. Then you can tighten the Allen wrench to lock them down.